When my father raised his glass that night, I thought, just for a moment, he might finally say my name with pride. He didn't. He smiled at the man standing beside him, called him the kind of hero I always hoped to raise, and the room erupted in applause. I kept my face steady, my hands clasped tight in my lap, like a child pretending not to bleed. I'd spent years swallowing small humiliations, telling myself he'd come around someday. But that night, watching him beam at someone else, I understood he never would. Something in me went quiet, quieter than the applause, quieter than the laughter that followed. It wasn't shock, it was clarity. Inez Calder finally knew. Silence had protected everyone but her. And from that moment on, she decided the next time her father spoke of honor, the truth would already be standing in the room, whether he was ready for it or not. The night my father was honored, the air inside the Veterans Hall felt too clean, too polished, like pride had a scent and someone had poured it over the room. His name echoed from the microphone as he stood beneath the flags, the bronze plaques, and the framed photos of men in uniform. The applause rose and fell in waves. Familiar, rhythmic, almost rehearsed. He looked right at home there. I sat near the back, where the light barely reached, my seat half hidden behind a column draped in red and gold bunting. I had learned over the years how to disappear in plain sight. Quiet posture, polite smile, hands folded neatly in my lap. There was a time I thought invisibility was safety. Tonight, it just felt like proof that I didn't belong. My father raised his glass, and the sound of clinking crystal swept across the room. That smile of his, controlled, confident, appeared just before the words he knew would draw applause. He thanked the audience for their service, for keeping the Calder legacy alive, for believing that honor was something you could pass down like a family heirloom. And then he turned, gesturing toward the man seated beside him. Captain Drew Rains stood up, his dress blues perfectly pressed, medals glinting under the lights. He was young, the kind of soldier people wanted to applaud. Handsome, upright, unscarred by time. My father's voice carried easily, warm but heavy. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate a man who reminds me what it truly means to serve." The crowd erupted. Applause thundered through the hall. Drew looked uncomfortable, his jaw tight, eyes flicking toward me for half a second before dropping to the floor. I lifted my glass, pretending to toast like everyone else. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. When the clapping faded, my father kept talking. He mentioned the family, his wife, his son-in-law, even the grandchildren. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, in that same proud tone, "And my daughter, Inez. She gave the military a try before realizing she was better suited for academic work." A few people laughed. Not cruelly, not loudly, just that kind of soft laughter people use when they don't know what else to do. My father chuckled along with them, perfectly comfortable. I smiled. Too. It was automatic. I'd practiced that smile in mirrors and meetings, in holidays and homecomings, the kind that says, "I'm fine, don't worry, nothing hurts." But something cracked beneath it. A thin, quiet break only I could hear. For years, I told myself he didn't mean to diminish me, that the small omissions, the dismissive jokes, the way he changed the subject when I spoke of my work, they were habits, not wounds. But sitting there, under the weight of those lights, I realized habits can cut just as deep as knives. When the speeches ended, people lined up to shake his hand. They called him Colonel, clapped him on the shoulder, told him he hadn't aged a day. He laughed easily, soaking in every ounce of admiration. I slipped out before he could notice I'd gone. Outside, the air was sharp enough to sting. The parking lot glittered with frost, the mountains beyond faint under the winter sky. I walked to my car without looking back. The laughter from the hall carried faintly through the glass doors, blending with the muffled sound of a band tuning up for the after-dinner music. Driving through downtown Colorado Springs, I let the city blur. Neon reflections stretched across the windshield, dissolving into streaks of color. My father's words looped in my mind. Not the compliment to Drew, but the effortless way he'd dismissed me, the quiet certainty that his version of honor had no room for mine. At a red light, I turned off the radio. Silence filled the car, heavy and alive. It reminded me of another silence, the kind that hums through a headset right before a decision that might save or cost lives. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. 10 years had passed since that night in a desert far from here. 10 years since I'd made a call no one ever heard me make. 54 men went home because of that transmission. I went home to nothing. I'd never told him. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew he wouldn't understand. My father's world had rules. Valor was loud, sacrifice was visible, and recognition was proof of worth. My kind of service didn't fit in a speech. The light turned green. I drove on, the hum of the engine steady beneath me. Somewhere between the interstate exits, the bitterness shifted into something colder, sharper, almost calm. Maybe silence had kept the peace long enough. Maybe it had protected him, and even me, from truths too heavy to carry out loud. But tonight, watching him raise a glass to another man's courage, I felt the first real crack in that peace. It wasn't rage. It wasn't grief. It was clarity. The road stretched ahead, long and dark, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like driving home. I just kept moving, the tires hissing over wet pavement, the reflection of streetlights sliding across the windshield like passing ghosts. Somewhere deep down, I knew something irreversible had happened, not in that hall, but inside me. The part of me that had waited for his pride had finally stopped waiting. He'd built a life out of speeches about honor. I'd built one out of silence. One of us was about to learn what the other's version truly meant. And this time, when the truth came for him, he wouldn't see it coming. 2 days later, Portland greeted me with rain, the kind that didn't pour but lingered, steady and cold, like a weight you couldn't brush off. The Veterans Center was quiet that afternoon, the echo of my footsteps swallowed by the concrete hallway. I went straight to the storage room, where we kept stacks of old training files, printouts, and medical evaluations from the therapy programs I'd been teaching. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, and the smell of dust mixed with the faint sting of disinfectant. I was halfway through sorting a box of outdated manuals when a low voice came from the doorway. "Excuse me, Ms. Calder?" I turned, startled. A tall man stood in the frame, his posture still military straight despite the years that had carved lines into his face. His hair was silver, cropped close, and his uniform jacket hung perfectly pressed across his shoulders. There was something about the way he said my name, measured, careful, respectful, that made the air in the room feel suddenly smaller. "I served under your father once," he said, "but I think I know your voice from somewhere else." I froze. My pulse stuttered, an instinct born long ago. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You worked with JSOC, didn't you? Forward Base Delta, Afghanistan, 2014. The sound of that name, the base, the year, sent a ripple through my chest. That place wasn't supposed to exist in anyone's memory except mine and a handful of classified files. He waited. The silence between us filled with the hum of the lights. "We were saved," he continued, "by an anonymous warning from someone using the codename Sable 9. If that message hadn't come through, we'd all be gone. I've been trying to find that voice for 10 years. His words hit me like cold water. For a second, I couldn't move. Then I turned back to the stack of folders, pretending to sort them again, as if my hands could hide what my face might reveal. "Some voices," I said finally, "are meant to disappear the moment they're heard." He studied me, a flicker of understanding passing through his eyes. Not certainty, but something close. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate, like a man paying respect at a grave. When he left, the door clicked shut behind him. The faint scent of tobacco lingered, curling through the stale air. His footsteps echoed down the hall, fading one at a time until they were gone. For a long while, I just stood there, staring at the doorway. I thought I had buried that version of myself deep enough that no one could ever dig her up again. But hearing that name out loud, Forward Base Delta, brought everything back in brutal clarity. The radio static, the hum of rotors, the heat pressing down on metal walls, the sound of men breathing on an open channel as they waited for orders that could save or destroy them. That night, back at my apartment, I sat on the floor of my small office, the only light coming from the desk lamp. The rain outside tapped against the window like restless fingers. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, reached past the folders, and pulled out a small metal box, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside was a folded flag patch, a commendation letter with no name, and a faded photo of a radar screen marked with a handwritten label, Shield, 2014. The ink had bled slightly, but I could still see the coordinates. I ran my thumb over the edge of the letter, tracing the faint indentation of a signature that wasn't really a signature at all, just initials. The line above them read, Mission accomplished, with her mind. It wasn't proof of anything, just paper and silence. But holding it now, I felt that same hum in my chest I'd felt that night in the desert, when the message I sent had reached them just in time, when the line went dead, and I knew they'd lived. The world never knew Sable 9 existed. That was the point. But the name still belonged to me, like a scar under a sleeve. I hadn't said it out loud in a decade. I closed my eyes and whispered it once, soft and steady, almost like a prayer. Sable 9. It sounded foreign now, but familiar too, like hearing your old name after living under another for too long. I shut the box and slid it back into the drawer, locking it with a click that echoed across the quiet room. When I stood, the radio on my shelf flickered to life with a burst of static. I hadn't touched it. The sound filled the apartment for a few seconds before fading into nothing but white noise. I stared at it, pulse quickening, and then turned it off. I told myself it was just interference, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had just reached back through the static of 10 long years. The next morning, my inbox was flooded with the usual university memos and student reports. I almost missed the last message in the pile. No subject line, no signature, just one line in plain text. If you're alive, thank you. You saved my brother. I reread it 3 times before checking the metadata. The location tag pointed to Fort Carson, Colorado. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding in my throat. Fort Carson. That was where Captain Drew Rains was stationed. The same man my father had toasted. The same man whose name had filled the room while mine was buried under polite applause. I closed the laptop slowly, the screen going dark. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the world slick and reflective. For a moment, I caught my own reflection in the glass. Still, calm, but with something flickering behind the eyes. Some stories don't stay buried. Some ghosts learn to write emails. And sometimes, the past doesn't knock. It just walks right back in. A week passed before the letter arrived. It was late afternoon when I found it wedged between a stack of utility bills and a local paper. The envelope was thick, plain, with no return address. Just my name written in a shaky hand that didn't look familiar. I tore it open at the kitchen counter, the paper rough beneath my fingers. Inside was a single page, creased down the middle, smudged in places like it had been folded and unfolded too many times. The handwriting slanted unevenly, as if the writer couldn't quite control his hand. Thank you, Sable 9. You saved more than you know. The words blurred slightly as I read them again. And again, until my eyes burned. The name, the one I hadn't spoken for years, stared back at me, pulled from the dark, and set down in black ink. Whoever had written it knew. I sat at the table for hours, the afternoon fading to dusk around me. The fridge hummed, the clock ticked, and still I couldn't move. My mind was already back there, back to the desert, the command tent, the endless static of the comms channel. I'd thought I'd locked that version of myself away, sealed her behind passwords and classified files, but this letter, simple and unmarked, had pried the lock open with 10 words. I knew the handwriting didn't matter. The message was what mattered, and the name Sable 9 didn't belong to many people, just one. Me. Eventually, I reached for my laptop. Old habits resurfaced like muscle memory. I traced the postmark, cross-referenced regional distribution centers, and ran the zip code through a tracking database I hadn't touched in years. It pointed me to a familiar place, Fort Carson, Colorado. My breath caught. That's where Captain Drew Rains was stationed. I didn't need proof to make the connection. I remembered the casualty reports from 2014. Private Luke Rains, killed by an IED during Operation Shield. The same operation my signal had reached seconds too late. I'd replayed that delay more times than I could count, wondering if a faster transmission, a slightly stronger connection, would have kept him alive. Now, years later, his brother was sending letters to thank a ghost. I opened the old encrypted files that still lived on an external drive, untouched since I left service. The access key burned in my memory like a scar. When the folders opened, I scrolled until I found the transmission log from that night. Line after line of timestamps, radio frequencies, data bursts. I knew exactly where to look. Transmission 23.47, 19. Incoming Sable 9 alert. Enemy movement east of Delta Ridge. 3 kilometer. Evacuation route recalculated. 23:50:21. Blast recorded at original coordinates. 3 minutes, that was all. 3 minutes between my warning and the explosion. 54 survived. 1 did not. I leaned back in my chair. The room suddenly too small, too quiet. My chest felt tight. Not from guilt. I'd lived with guilt long enough to recognize its shape, but from something heavier, older, regret mixed with inevitability. The letter in front of me wasn't just a thank you. It was a reminder that even silence leaves echoes. By nightfall, I still hadn't moved the letter from the counter. It sat beside a cold cup of tea, its edges curling from the damp air. Out of habit, I turned on the TV, hoping for noise to drown the thoughts pressing in. And there he was, my father, sitting tall in an interview chair, wearing that same self-assured expression he'd perfected over decades. The chyron beneath his face read, "Veteran leader speaks on honor and legacy." He leaned forward slightly as he spoke. "I've always told my students, real honor only exists when others can see it." My hand froze around the remote. The air in the room thickened. I watched his eyes. The conviction there, the ease with which he believed himself. He truly thought honor needed witnesses, that a man's worth was measured in how loud others clapped for him. I turned off the TV. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was suffocation. "There are people," I whispered into the stillness, "who stay silent just to protect the ones who don't deserve it." The bulb in the hallway flickered, then steadied again. I watched the reflection of its light dance across the windowpane, thin and trembling. Somewhere deep inside, I felt that familiar tension, like the line between past and present had just been pulled too tight. I went to bed late. The letter still unfolded on the kitchen table. It was the first thing I saw when morning light crept in. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I traced the words again with my fingertip, as if touching them would somehow make sense of it all. That's when the phone rang. At first, I ignored it, but it kept ringing, persistent, insistent, unwilling to be silenced. I picked it up without checking the number. The voice on the other end was hesitant. Low. "Inez, this is Drew Rains." My throat closed. I didn't speak. "Colonel Lee told me who you are," he said, his words catching. "You're Sable 9, aren't you?" I still didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough for him to fill it. "My brother's last letter," he continued quietly, "mentioned a voice. He said it sounded calm, said it kept him steady until the end. That was you, wasn't it?" Something in my chest twisted. I could have confirmed it, could have given him the closure he was reaching for. But closure is a privilege, and I'd learned long ago that truth doesn't always heal. Sometimes, to survive, you have to hide your own voice. It came out softer than I intended. There was a pause, the kind that hums with everything left unsaid. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. The letter still lay open on the table. A drop of water, maybe from my hand, maybe from my eyes, fell onto the ink, smudging the word thank. I folded the page carefully, pressing along the crease, and slid it back into the envelope. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Because now, that invisible line that had always tethered me to the past, one I'd spent years pretending didn't exist, was no longer reaching backward. It was pulling forward, straight toward my father. The man who'd built his life around the idea that honor must be seen was about to find out what it looked like when truth walked in wearing silence. The first message came from one of my students. "Look, Professor, your dad made the front page. I was grading papers when it appeared on my screen." I clicked the link without thinking. The headline filled my phone. "The Calder Legacy, a father and his protégé uphold a family's honor." Below, it was a photograph so polished it almost glowed. My father stood in the center, chin lifted, shaking hands with Captain Drew Rains. Their medals gleamed under the camera lights, each reflection sharper than the last. And there, behind them, barely visible, me, caught mid-step, head bent as I reached for a bottle of water, blurred enough to seem accidental. The caption beneath the image was small, almost apologetic. Inez Calder, the academic daughter who chose a quieter life. I stared at those two words, quieter life. It was meant as a description, maybe even a compliment, but the longer I looked at it, the more it felt like a verdict, a label carved into stone, a lifetime of silence reduced to a single line under someone else's story. I shut the laptop and pressed my palms to my eyes. There was a ringing in my ears, a kind of static that made it hard to breathe. All I could think was how easily they'd managed to rewrite everything, how a single photo could erase a decade of service, a decade of nights when I'd sat in the dark and listened for the sound of lives being saved by words no one would ever hear. The next morning, my classroom buzzed louder than usual. Conversations hushed as I walked in. Students glanced at one another, the way people do when they want to ask, but are too polite to say it outright. Halfway through the lecture, one of them finally raised his hand. "You really served in the military, right?" he asked. Tentative. Or was it more like, support work? I smiled faintly, not because it was funny, but because I'd been waiting for that question my entire life. I said, "I don't know if I was ever what you'd call a soldier, but I've been in places where people lived only because someone stayed quiet at the right time." The room went still. A few heads tilted in confusion. Others just looked down at their notebooks, unsure whether I was joking or confessing. I didn't explain. Some things couldn't be translated into lesson plans. That night, my phone rang again. The voice on the line was rough, strained. "Drew Rains. Colonel Lee told me. You were there. You were Sable 9. I stayed silent, fingers tightening around the phone. He hesitated. "My brother's last transmission. He mentioned a woman's voice. Said it was calm. Said it kept him steady. That was you, wasn't it?" I took a breath. If he truly understood what silence meant, he wouldn't have to ask. There was a pause. Then his voice cracked. "You saved me, Inez." I hung up. I didn't want to hear that word anymore. Saved. It didn't feel like gratitude. It felt like a wound reopening. Sleep didn't come that night. I made coffee instead and sat by the window until sunrise, watching the first light touch the rooftops of Portland. The city looked indifferent, as it always did, but something in me felt off balance, as if the ground beneath years of silence had begun to shift. The next morning, the silence broke in a different way. My email feed filled with headlines. Anonymous Special Forces officer confirms he was saved by Sable 9. The article was short, speculative, written with that polished tone reporters use when they know they've struck gold but don't have proof yet. No names were mentioned, but the code name, mine, was printed in bold. So much for anonymity. I sat frozen for a while, staring at the screen. Then another email arrived. No address, no signature, just one sentence. If you keep hiding, others will rewrite your story. No punctuation, no context, just that. It could have been Drew. It could have been my father. I wasn't sure which possibility unsettled me more. I opened the old archive folder again, scrolling through the photos from the SHIELD operation. Sand, smoke, shadows. The kind of images that carried more silence than sound. And then I saw him. In the corner of one picture, half obscured by a tent pole, stood a young man in uniform. His face sunburned, mouth set in a grim half-smile. Private Luke Rains, Drew's brother, the one who hadn't made it out. I hadn't noticed him before. Or maybe I'd spent years trying not to. I traced his face on the screen with my fingertip. That day came rushing back. The urgency in the radio chatter, the coordinates blinking red. The moment the signal finally went through. And then the blast. 3 minutes too late. 3 minutes between life and death. 54 men lived because of a message I sent. One didn't. And the man my father now called his protégé, his perfect example of honor, was the brother of the one I couldn't save. The irony was cruel enough to make me laugh, but the sound that came out wasn't laughter. It was the kind of sound that escapes when you've been holding your breath for too long. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The world outside went on without me. People commuting, coffee brewing, someone's dog barking down the hall. But inside that apartment, everything felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves had started to remember. I thought of my father again, of his voice on the television, confident and unshakable. Honor exists only when it's witnessed. Would he feel the same if he knew his daughter had carried a mission no one could ever speak of? If he knew I'd saved lives, but failed to save the brother of the man he now paraded beside him? Would that make him proud? Or would it simply stain his speeches? The thought was almost unbearable. I shut the laptop and sat in the dark, the glow of the city flickering faintly through the blinds. I used to believe silence protected me. Now I wondered if it was protecting everyone else instead. Everyone who got to live inside their version of the story, while mine stayed buried beneath it. But something told me the quiet wouldn't hold much longer. The name Sable 9 had escaped the shadows. And once truth slips out, no one, not even the man who worships the idea of honor, can shove it back in. 2 weeks passed before my father called again. His voice came through the line sharp and commanding, like it still carried the weight of a drill sergeant's whistle. He didn't ask, he ordered. "You will attend the Veterans Humanitarian of the Year ceremony." No excuses. I was about to tell him no, to remind him that I hadn't been part of his public displays for years, but then he said something that stopped me cold. "This is your chance to see what real honor looks like." I sat there for a long moment after he hung up, the quiet in my apartment pressing close. I could have ignored him, but I went. Maybe some small, foolish part of me still wanted to see what he thought real honor meant. The ballroom at the Denver Grand Hotel glowed under chandeliers. Flags lined the stage, polished brass glinting beneath spotlights. Every table shimmered with white linen and glassware. Every chair filled with a veteran, a politician, or someone eager to shake hands with both. The air smelled faintly of champagne and starch. I chose a seat in the third row, near the aisle, where I could leave easily if I needed to. The closer rows were packed with uniforms and photographers. At the front, my father sat beside Drew Rains, the two of them framed perfectly by the stage lights. Drew didn't look back at me, but his posture was tense, his shoulders drawn up, like he wanted to shrink inside his own dress blues. When the host finally introduced him, my father rose and walked to the podium, his medals catching the light. The room fell into a respectful hush. He began the way he always did, with conviction, gravity, control. He spoke about service, sacrifice, and legacy, his voice deep and practiced, honed by decades of being listened to. "I've been fortunate," he said, "to spend my life serving this country. But my greatest joy has been seeing that same spirit live on in those I've mentored. Men like Captain Drew Rains, proof that honor can be passed down like a flame that never dies. Applause rolled across the room, a sound almost physical in its force. People stood, clapping, cheering. My father beamed, eyes bright with pride as Drew shook his hand. The cameras flashed, freezing the moment in a dozen angles. Then his tone softened, and he continued, a hint of paternal affection slipping into his voice. And of course, my daughter Inez, who also served for a short time before choosing a different path, teaching, helping others through the challenges of reintegration. I'm proud she knows her limits. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was casual, polite, the kind that fills a silence when people aren't sure what else to do. But it hit like a bullet. My hand clenched around my glass until it trembled. I stared at the stage lights until they blurred. He smiled at me from up there, unaware or unwilling to see the damage his words had just done. One drop fell from my chin to my hand. I didn't know if it was sweat or a tear, and it didn't matter. He finished his speech with another round of applause. I thought I could slip out quietly once the ceremony moved on, before the press swarmed, but then a voice cut through the noise from the first row. With all due respect, Mr. Calder, you forgot someone. The room froze. Heads turned. My father blinked, his expression faltering for the first time that evening. Colonel Ezra Lee stood slowly, his frame straight, his gaze unflinching. His tone was calm, but carried enough weight to silence the crowd. In 2014, he said, at Forward Base Delta, I lost 6 men under my command. I'm alive today because of an intelligence alert, an anonymous one, from a female officer using the codename Sable 9. If that message hadn't come through, 54 soldiers would have died. And that person, that voice, is sitting in this room. Inez Calder. The air in the ballroom changed. The applause stopped. The buzz of conversation died like a switch had been thrown. You could hear the whir of a camera lens adjusting, the faint hum of the overhead lights. My father's face went pale. His grip on the podium tightened until his knuckles whitened. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Drew looked down, shoulders rigid. His lips moved, barely audible, forming what looked like an apology I didn't want to hear. Reporters in the back exchanged glances. Someone whispered. Then came the first flash, bright, blinding, and the next. The hum of cameras began to swell again, feeding on the tension. I stood up slowly, my pulse steady but distant, like it belonged to someone else. If truth has to be shouted, I said softly, it isn't truth anymore. Then I turned and walked toward the exit. No one stopped me. The air behind me felt heavy, electric, as if the whole room had been stripped bare. When I reached the doors, faint applause started again, uncertain, fragmented, like a handful of people clapping at the wrong time. To me, it sounded like the dull crack of gunfire after the echo dies. Outside, the Denver night was sharp enough to cut. The cold bit into my skin as I stepped onto the pavement. The wind carried the faint hum of city traffic, distant and indifferent. I kept walking toward the parking lot, heels clicking against concrete. Behind me, the sound of clapping faded into nothing. In the reflection of a parked car's window, I saw the ballroom lights spilling through the glass doors. Bright, sterile, hollow. My own reflection stared back at me, doubled in the tint, warped at the edges. It didn't look like the woman who'd walked in earlier that night. Footsteps echoed behind me. Drew's voice reached me before I turned. I didn't know he was going to say your name. I swear I didn't. I stopped, facing the wind instead of him. The night air burned in my throat when I spoke. It doesn't matter, but you should understand, when someone else tells your story, it stops belonging to you. He didn't answer. I didn't wait. I walked away, each step heavier than the last, the sound of my heels drowned out by the wind. At the far end of the lot, I stopped beside my car. The glass reflected 2 versions of me, one clear, one distorted. I stood there for a moment, watching the 2 images merge and split again. The past I'd locked in a steel box for 10 years had just been dragged into the light, stripped of context, handed to the world to dissect. And there, in the middle of Denver, with the smell of exhaust and cold metal in the air, I realized something brutal and irreversible. The truth wasn't buried anymore. It had been torn open in front of strangers, by men who thought they were doing the right thing. But the right thing, I knew, can still ruin a life. I opened the car door, slid inside, and sat there for a long moment without starting the engine. The applause, the lights, the cameras, they all replayed in fragments behind my eyelids. Outside, the night went on as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. Because for me, for him, for all of us who had lived and lied by the weight of that word honor, nothing would ever be the same again. I wasn't the first to see the headlines. By the time I opened my laptop the next morning, my inbox was already overflowing with messages, some from colleagues trying to sound supportive, others from people I hadn't spoken to in years, all circling around the same story. Marine veteran Calder didn't know his daughter was a war hero, the man who taught honor, blinded by his own pride. Every outlet had its own version, each headline slicing deeper. Social media was worse, people debating, dissecting, turning my family into a morality tale. They called it the Sable 9 story. Some were inspired, most were entertained. And my father, once the symbol of unshakable pride, had become a national punchline. The phone rang and rang. I ignored it until I recognized his number. When I finally picked up, his voice was rough, strained, but still carried that unmistakable tone of command. "You've made me a national embarrassment," he said. I took a breath, steady and low. "No, Father." I stayed silent. People are laughing because they finally realized how loud you've been. The line went quiet. Then the call ended. No goodbye. No breath between. Just silence. That afternoon, I drove through the steady drizzle that always hung over Portland. Each stoplight flickered red on the wet pavement, as if the world itself had turned into a warning sign. I tried not to look at the notifications on my phone, tried not to imagine him in Colorado, sitting at his desk, seeing his name trending for all the wrong reasons. By late evening, the news came. He'd collapsed during a veterans board meeting, minor stroke. The message said, "Stable condition, hospitalized in Denver." The next flight out was half empty. I barely remembered the trip. When I reached the hospital, the smell of antiseptic hit me before I saw him. My father, the man who'd commanded platoons, who could silence a room with one look, lay in a hospital bed, face pale and lips cracked. The hum of the monitors filled the room. His hands, always restless and strong, now trembled against the white sheets. For a while, I just stood in the doorway, watching the rise and fall of his chest, trying to remember the last time I'd seen him still. When his eyes opened, they found mine immediately. His voice was a rasp, the words dragging out like gravel. "I was afraid," he said slowly, "that you'd surpass me." I moved closer, took his hand. It was colder than I expected. "Honor doesn't have ranks," I told him. He closed his eyes again, a faint exhale escaping like defeat. "I just wanted to be someone you could be proud of." I swallowed hard. The room felt too small, too white, too clean for everything unspoken between us. "I just wanted you to see me," I said. The monitor beeped. Steady but fragile. That sound, sharp, repetitive, was a strange comfort. For the first time, his world wasn't built on control or applause. It was just breath, heartbeat, survival. I stayed with him until the nurse asked me to leave. On my way out, something caught my eye on the side table, a folded newspaper, creased and smudged from his hands. The headline read, "Hero in the Shadows, Sable 9. Someone, him, had circled it in red pen. Beneath it, a note written in shaky cursive. "My mistake." I stared at those two words until the letters blurred. My chest tightened, caught between grief and relief. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But for him, it was more than I'd ever thought I'd get. 3 days later, they discharged him. I offered to stay, but he refused. I could tell he wanted solitude, or maybe punishment. The house that once overflowed with visitors was now quiet. Curtains drawn, phone disconnected. No one came to see him. For a man who'd built his life around recognition, being forgotten was the cruelest wound. I knew because I'd lived that wound myself. I went back to Portland. The press had begun to move on to another scandal, another name. But his image, my image, lingered like smoke. Every time I checked the news, some op-ed writer dissected our story. The irony of honor, the silent daughter, and the proud father. None of them knew us. None of them cared to. That evening, as I was shutting down my computer, a new email appeared. No sender, no subject, just one line in the message body. Someone at the Pentagon is reopening Operation Shield. Your father's signature appears in the old funding file. I read it twice, pulse picking up. There was no signature, no traceable address, but the details were too precise to be coincidence. I opened the classified archive again, the one I'd sworn never to touch. Page after page of authorization forms scrolled by until I found it. Funding approval, Calder, C. My father's name. His signature. The same hand that had circled my mistake 3 days ago. The breath caught in my throat. He had signed the original authorization for Operation Shield. He had helped fund the mission that nearly took my life, without ever knowing I was the one directing it. He'd been part of it all along, unknowingly tied to the same chain of events he'd later condemn. The irony settled over me like a weight. He'd spent a lifetime teaching about honor, but the truest form of it had passed through his hands unnoticed. His own daughter's work, buried under the paperwork he'd signed without reading. Everything connected in a sickening circle. His lessons, my silence, the mission, the fallout. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at his name on the screen. The cursor blinked beneath it, waiting for something. A reaction, a decision, maybe forgiveness. But I didn't move. The world outside my window had turned black. The rain came again, tapping against the glass, steady and relentless. I thought of him sitting alone in that dark house, surrounded by medals and framed photos that no longer meant what they used to. He'd spent his life preaching that honor had to be seen to be real. Now the world had seen too much of him, and what they saw had broken him. And me. I'd built a life on silence, thinking it would protect us both. But silence, like pride, has a breaking point. Somewhere between those headlines, the hospital room, and that email, something shifted inside me. I no longer felt like the invisible daughter. I felt like the keeper of a truth neither of us was ready to carry. The truth was simple and cruel. The legacy he'd built on the image of honor had come full circle, and it was his own signature that tied us together in the story neither of us could escape. The sound of rain grew louder, filling the apartment until it felt like the walls were breathing. I closed the laptop, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity, heavy, painful, undeniable. He wasn't my enemy. He was just another casualty of the same idea that had once trapped me too. And as I sat there in the quiet, I understood. This wasn't the end of him, or me. It was the beginning of whatever came after the fall. A week later, the world started talking again. But this time, it sounded different. The Defense Herald released a new feature under the headline, "The Quiet Analyst Behind Operation Shield." No names, no faces, just a story. It described an unnamed female intelligence officer whose quick decision had rerouted a doomed convoy, saving over 50 soldiers from an ambush. The article didn't mention ranks, units, or medals, only the silence that had followed. For once, no one asked, "Who was she?" They asked, "Why did she stay quiet?" The story spread fast. Within hours, it appeared on veteran forums, national outlets, and discussion panels. Commentators debated what kind of world forced its heroes into silence. For the first time in years, the conversation wasn't about who deserved glory. It was about what kind of truth people were willing to ignore. I sat in my living room, the article glowing on my laptop screen, the cursor blinking beneath the last sentence. My coffee had gone cold. I wasn't sure what I felt. relief, fear, or the familiar ache of being seen too late. A soft knock pulled me from my thoughts. I opened the door to find Drew, standing under the hallway light. He wasn't in uniform this time, just a plain jacket, worn jeans, and the look of someone who hadn't slept. His eyes were sunken, his voice low. "I'm the one who told them," he said, "about Operation Shield. Not to get you recognition, but to stop them from twisting it any further. You deserve the truth, not a medal." I didn't answer. I just stepped aside, letting him in. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring at the rain streaking down the glass. "You know," he said quietly, "Luke once told me something. He said, if I die out there, at least someone will understand why." He paused, eyes finding mine. "I think he meant you." My throat tightened. I turned away before he could see it happen. The tears, the years of control finally slipping. The sound of rain filled the silence between us. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady again. "Sometimes, understanding costs more than ignorance ever will." He nodded, not arguing. For the first time since all of this began, I realized Drew didn't look like the soldier my father idolized. He looked like someone trying to carry too much of everyone else's guilt. When he left, I stood by the door long after it closed, the echo of his words still hanging in the room. The screen of my laptop glowed faintly from across the table, casting its reflection on the floor. The quiet analyst behind Operation Shield. It was the truth, but only part of it, and part truths have a way of becoming their own kind of lie. That night, my phone buzzed again. The news was everywhere. My father had resigned from his position at the Veterans Council, citing health reasons, but those who knew him, the ones who whispered behind closed doors, called it what it was. Removal. The scandal of Sable 9 had cost him everything he'd built. I closed my eyes. For the first time, I didn't feel anger, just an ache that came from knowing humiliation was the only thing that could humble him. The next day, I drove to Colorado Springs. His house looked smaller than I remembered. The lawn was untrimmed. The porch light still on, though it was daylight. When I stepped inside, the air smelled of dust and old paper. The walls were still lined with medals and framed certificates, each polished to a dull gleam. But one spot on the wall stood empty, a perfect square of lighter paint where a photo had once hung. The photo of us, taken years ago, the day I graduated from basic training. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I found him, staring at nothing. "Where's the picture?" I asked. He didn't look up. I put it away. It reminded me I'd been blind. "You weren't blind," I said softly. "You just refused to open your eyes." His shoulders sank, the first sign of defeat I'd ever seen in him. "I've lost everything," he murmured. "Are you satisfied now?" I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "No, but now you know what losing feels like. I lost your pride 10 years ago." He looked up then, eyes rimmed red, not from anger this time, but exhaustion, the kind that goes deeper than the body. After a long silence, he said, barely above a whisper, "I read that article. The woman they wrote about, it's you, isn't it?" I didn't answer. I just gave him a faint smile, the kind that carried all the things we'd never said. His gaze lingered, searching for confirmation I didn't give, and for once, he didn't demand it. When I left, the house felt even darker. The air hung heavy with the scent of rusted pride. The following morning, I was sitting at my desk when the phone rang. The number flashed as restricted. I hesitated, then answered. It was Colonel Lee. "Your father wants to attend the private recognition ceremony at the Pentagon next month," he said. "He asked if you'd allow it." The question caught me off guard. I turned toward the window. Outside, a line of black crows cut across the gray sky, their wings silent against the clouds. "If he really wants to understand what silence means," I said after a long pause, "then let him come." When the call ended, I sat for a while, staring at the sky. The crows had already disappeared beyond the rooftops. For the first time since everything began, I felt something almost like calm, not forgiveness, not yet, but a shift, subtle and real. My father had finally stopped defending his legacy and started trying to understand mine. The world was still talking about Sable 9, about the nameless analyst who had saved 54 men and vanished. But for once, the story wasn't about glory. It was about silence, and what it cost to keep it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. 3 weeks later, the letter arrived. Heavy paper, ivory-colored, stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense. The words were simple, almost understated. Private recognition ceremony. Operation Shield. Level classified. No press. No cameras. No audience beyond the few names printed on the clearance list. My first instinct was to decline. I had spent too many years hiding to want a ceremony. But that evening, Colonel Lee called. His voice was calm, deliberate. Your father has already confirmed. He's coming. The morning of the ceremony. Washington was wrapped in a thin veil of fog, the kind that softened the city's edges, turning everything to quiet gold. I walked through the side entrance of the Pentagon, my footsteps echoing down the sterile corridor. The guard handed me a badge stamped Civilian Re-Entry. My hands trembled as I signed it. The room was smaller than I imagined. Low ceiling, warm yellow light. 5 officers seated around a narrow wooden table. On the center lay a folded American flag, its corners perfectly aligned. Someone began to read. For exceptional intelligence work under Operation Shield, the operative known as Sable 9 is hereby recognized for actions that saved 54 soldiers from a fatal ambush. No applause followed. None was needed. The only sound was the steady tick of a wall clock, each second marking the years between who I had been and who I had become. I bowed my head. It felt less like acknowledgement and more like release. When I lifted my eyes, I saw him. At the back of the room, my father stood with the help of a cane. His posture was still straight, but his shoulders had softened. His eyes, once sharp as polished steel, held something warmer, an understanding he had never known how to show. Then, without a word, he bowed. Not as a soldier salutes a superior, not as a father indulges a child. It was deeper, slower, a gesture of gratitude stripped of pride. My breath caught. I had chased his approval for half a lifetime, only to realize that this moment, this silent, imperfect bow, was all I had ever needed. Colonel Lee stepped forward, shook my hand, and whispered, "Some heroes don't need an audience." I met his eyes and replied quietly, "And some fathers finally learn that." The light caught my father's face as he straightened. He nodded once, then again, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The world, for a fleeting moment, felt right again. As we left the room, he walked beside me, the rhythm of his cane steady against the marble floor. Near the doorway, he leaned closer and murmured, his voice rough with age and something like wonder, "Inez, I signed the funding for SHIELD back in 2014. You were saving lives under a mission I unknowingly helped create." I stopped, the air thick between us. My reply came softly, almost like an exhale. Then, maybe we were on the same side all along. For the first time since I was a child, he smiled without armor, without performance, just a man seeing his daughter clearly for the first time. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. The morning sun broke through, pale and clean, washing the world in light, and in that quiet brightness, I finally understood. Some reconciliations don't need words, only the sound of 2 hearts learning to beat in the same rhythm again. A month after the ceremony at the Pentagon, I drove back to Colorado Springs. The air was thinner there, sharper, as if the altitude itself demanded honesty. My father's house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with aging maples, their leaves already beginning to turn. The blinds were half drawn. The porch light still burned even in daylight, a habit of his that I never quite understood. Inside, the silence was almost physical. I could hear the slow, rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock he'd kept since I was a child. The house smelled faintly of cedar and dust and something softer. Tea leaves? Maybe? On the dining table sat a worn leather notebook, its edges curled. The words "for Inez" scrawled across the front in a shaky hand. I hesitated before touching it, as if the act itself might open something I wasn't ready to face. Then I opened it. The first pages were filled with uneven notes, lists of medications, reminders for checkups, small grocery items, and a few sentences about my mother. The writing wobbled. The letters crowded together like they were trying to hold on to each other. But halfway through, the handwriting changed. It steadied, deepened, as though the man who wrote it had decided to stop pretending. Inez has her mother's quiet fire. I feared her light would show where I had dimmed. I used to think pride was louder than love. Now I know it only makes love harder to hear. The words blurred as my tears fell across the page. I pressed my hand over them, feeling the indentation of his pen strokes like a pulse beneath my palm. Then I closed the book and looked up. He was standing in the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame, a mug of tea in one trembling hand. His face looked older than I remembered, not just in years, but in weight, the kind that comes from realizing what you can't undo. I didn't know how long he'd been there watching me. He cleared his throat, voice rough but steady. I didn't know how to apologize. He said quietly, so I wrote instead. I wiped at my cheeks, managing a small smile. You don't need to be sorry, I told him. You just need to be here. Something eased in his shoulders. He took a careful sip of his tea, then asked, almost shyly, Sable 9. What kind of bird is that supposed to be? I laughed softly through my tears. A bird that never sings while it's flying. He stared past me, his eyes distant, thoughtful. After a moment, he nodded slowly. Then I think I finally understand. You weren't silent out of fear. You were silent because you were loyal to what was right. I didn't trust my voice enough to answer. I just reached out and squeezed his hand. When he turned to refill his cup, I opened the notebook again. Near the end, something thin was tucked between the pages. I pulled it free. A faded photograph of me in uniform, standing before a radar antenna, wind whipping my hair across my face. On the back, written in the same trembling script, were 7 words. You were my pride long before I knew it. The breath caught in my throat. I pressed the photo to my chest, and for the first time in years, the tears that came weren't bitter. They were something gentler, a release. That night, as the sky outside turned indigo, he sat at his desk, shuffling through papers. The lamplight traced every crease in his face. The years of command and stubbornness etched there like battle scars. After a while, he looked up and said, almost to himself, I need your help with something. I'm writing my speech for the National Memorial in Denver. This time, I want to say what's right, not what gets applause. The way the light hit his profile, soft, steady, human, made my throat ache. For once, he didn't look like a man trying to be a symbol. He just looked like my father. And sitting there, in the quiet rhythm of his pen, scratching across the page, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about seeing the fear that lives behind someone's pride and choosing not to hold it against them anymore. The words in his notebook weren't a perfect apology, but they were enough. Enough to heal the parts of me that had spent too long waiting to be seen. And that night, for the first time in years, we wrote in the same room, under the same lamp, without a single word needing to be explained. A year later, I stood at the lectern of West Point, facing a room of cadets in crisp uniforms. The course was psychological intelligence and moral conflict. Behind me, the first slide glowed softly on the screen. Dedicated to my father, who taught me that silence can be courage. The room was still. Rows of young faces watched me, waiting, notebooks open but untouched. I spoke of Operation Shield, not as history, but as a study in quiet bravery. I didn't name names or speak of ranks. I only talked about what it means to act when no one is watching, to hold a truth you can never say out loud. When class ended, one cadet lingered, tall, steady, with a name tag that caught my eye. Rains. He hesitated before speaking. "Ma'am, my brother once talked about a voice that saved him. He said it sounded like hope. Was that you?" I smiled. Maybe. Or maybe it was his own courage echoing back. He nodded, saluted, and walked toward the door. The late afternoon sun pouring through the windows in long golden lines. Outside, flags rippled against a soft blue sky. A small flock of black birds crossed above the parade ground, their formation sharp and quiet. In my mind, I heard my father's voice again. There are two kinds of heroes, those who wear their medals, and those who carry secrets. And my answer rose within me, calm and certain. And the ones who understand both are the luckiest. That evening, I drove to my father's house. He was at his desk, pen in hand, working on a new speech. When he saw me, he smiled faintly and crossed out a line that read, "Captain Rains, the real hero." In its place, he wrote, "My daughter, Inez, the quiet strength behind our family's honor." I touched his shoulder. "You don't have to write that." He looked up, eyes gentle. "I do. To remember that I was once wrong." We stepped out to the porch as the sun sank behind the Rockies. The flag on his lawn stirred in the wind, the sound soft, almost rhythmic. He chuckled quietly, watching a line of crows glide overhead, dark silhouettes against a fading orange sky. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes. It's the sound of pride, isn't it?" He smiled, the light catching the lines on his face. This time, yes. The day slipped into stillness, the air calm and golden. No applause, no speeches. Just two people who had once stood on opposite sides of silence, now sharing it, finally knowing that sometimes silence itself is the loudest kind of victory.